Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. I'm Diane Sare, president of the LaRouche Organization, and this evening we are going to be discussing with Bill Jones and Chris Sare, my husband, the 300th anniversary of the Russian Academy of Science, which was founded 300 years ago by Peter the Great, who was a collaborator of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who should be known as one of the geniuses who provided the ideas behind the American Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence. Now, that's particularly important today because, as people who have been watching the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche Organization, my campaign, etc., and when I was running for U.S. Senate, are aware that we are really on the cusp of thermonuclear war. It's an extremely dangerous situation, that it's not clear exactly why the Biden administration or who in the Biden administration is making these decisions. Is it just to sour grapes to throw in a monkey wrench and make sure that Trump is not able to function? Is it to, quote unquote, Trump-proof NATO, to hand him a war which he can't get out of, to try and provoke President Putin into doing something which forces the hand of an incoming President Trump? It's not clear. It's known that the British House of Lords wrote a report on a meeting in 2019 where they said that Donald Trump should never be elected to a second term because he could destroy the special relationship between the US and the UK. And what they particularly were afraid of is that he would weaken NATO, which would be a good idea. As people may know, I think NATO should be abolished. There's no use for that organization anymore. It should have been done away with when the Warsaw Pact ended, or that he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords unilaterally also, which was the right thing to do in that case. Usually the things that the British elites complain about people doing are the right thing to do, similar to creeps in the US rogue intelligence agencies and our State Department. But as you know, in the last weeks, we have now had the US and France and the UK authorizing Zelensky to use long-range missiles, in the case of the US, the ATACMS missiles, into indisputably Russian territory to attack and kill Russians. Russia, in response to this decision, then launched a new experimental intermediate range missile, the Orezhnik, into Ukraine. This missile travels at Mach 10. It cannot be stopped. In an interview yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago, done by Tucker Carlson in Russia with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, Lavrov said the Russians had informed the United States 30 minutes prior to launch to let them know that this was not a nuclear warhead. It wasn't something more dangerous, but they would be launching this missile. And the Russians said they will always announce when they're going to launch such things, because since they can't be stopped, they don't have to worry about people preventing them, but they want to give time for these civilians to be removed. Now, obviously, this is an insane situation to be sitting on and talking about. And we have other crises flaring up in Syria. We had a peculiar situation in South Korea with the declaration of martial law, which was then defeated by the parliament. We have Georgia, we have Romania. We also have the government of France collapsing. Why? Because the people, just as the people in the United States voted for Trump because they didn't want a continuation of the war policy of the Biden-Harris regime, they also didn't want the genocide, but that was a harder choice to find a candidate who's totally free from AIPAC influence. But they voted against war. And the people in France are upset because the government has increased the defense budget by 40%. They're sending long-range missiles into Ukraine. They're talking about um, they're talking about uh, troops. Even some months back, you might remember, President Macron was talking about sending French troops to Ukraine. Complete insanity. And the population is rejecting that. So there was a no confidence vote. The prime minister is out, and that government doesn't exist. The German government is completely unstable. Now, Helga LaRouche is mobilizing with many minor parties to try and keep Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, in power. There'll be a confidence or no confidence vote on December 16th. He's terrible. But for whatever reason, Olaf Scholz is opposing sending the Taurus long-range missiles from Germany into Ukraine, and therefore he is the one leader in Europe who has such technology who's not willing to share it with Ukraine. And therefore, there's now a coalition forming to try and keep him in power. It's frankly embarrassing, the very low quality of leadership that we see in the West in a moment of crisis like this. Now, I also just want to say that the debt in the United States is now $100 trillion. If you add our federal debt, our personal debt, our business debt, and local debt, $100 trillion of debt. This is an unsustainable system. And that's what is powering this war drive, which is so dangerous. And that's why the conference tomorrow of the Schiller Institute on Pearl Harbor Day, after all, starting at 9 a.m. with a strategic panel, and we'll go through more of this, chaired by Helga LaRouche, an afternoon panel at 1 o'clock, and then again on Sunday, a morning panel. And on Sunday morning, we will be joined by Ted Postal, but also Naledi Pandor, who was the former foreign minister of South Africa, who brought their case against Israel to the International Court of Justice. She's a real powerhouse. I'm quite excited about that. And then Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock will be the panel on culture, which I will be the keynote speaker of that. So I hope you tune into the full conference. And combined with this, Scott Ritter issued a call for people to come to Washington, D.C., and he will be holding an event with others at the National Press Club on the war danger, designed also to move the Congress and to move President-elect Donald Trump to actually say that when he comes into office, that he is going to revoke the authorization to use ATACMS missiles, that he is going to make a statement now to that effect to pull us back from the brink of thermonuclear war. Ritter's point in an interview that I was in with him earlier today just made the point that, first of all, we have to be alive. I agree. Then, when we are alive, we have to organize the future of mankind, which should be a bright future, not a future formed by empire. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce first my friend Bill Jones, longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, writer for Executive Intelligence Review, author, and he just addressed an event at the Russian Cultural Center, I believe in Washington, D.C., on this anniversary. So, Bill, I'm going to remove myself and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. A pleasure to be here. I'll mention initially the event at the Cultural Center. Maybe we'll put up that picture with me and the flags to give you an idea of what the center looks like. You see to me sitting there, and then you have the painting on the wall, which is the American and the Russian flag during the American Revolution. If you count the stars, I'm sure you will find that it was an earlier one, but maybe not. But the paintings on the wall reflect the history of the U.S.-Russia relationship going back to that period, including with a portrait of Catherine the Great, John Paul Jones, who was the head of the Navy for Catherine's Navy for some time after he fought in the American Revolution. His picture is also there. This was dedicated in 1994. I was there at the dedication, and it was a period when we were, in one sense, renewing a relationship with what had become now an independent country, Russia, out of the fall of the Soviet Union. And this was an attempt to cement the cultural ties between the two countries. One of the people who was president at that time was Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space, and she was there at the dedication. And her name is also emblazoned in the on the front of the building, together with the ambassadors and others who were there at the dedication. So for me, it had a very personal place. In fact, I took a few Russian lessons at the academy during the early 2000s in preparation for an envisioned trip again to Russia, which didn't come off because I didn't get my visa in time. But at any rate, I have this relationship, and we have been working with them. This is one of the areas, most of, as you probably realize, most of the Russian-U.S. Diplomatic relationships have been not severed, but have been frozen. The former ambassador, Anatoly Antonov, once said to a friend who was visiting him here in Washington, they were walking around, I think, walking around the White House. He could not get a meeting at the White House. He couldn't get a meeting at the State Department. He was kind of frozen out. And he was really one of the highest level ambassadors in the Foreign Service. And he was here, and his comments were, I'm in a golden cage. I can't do anything. So the fact that he was removed, of course, I don't think he was so upset about it, because I think he felt that with his capabilities, he in this situation, he wasn't able to really accomplish any forward motion. That will be changed, of course. They don't have an ambassador now, but they will have probably by January, and we have an idea of who it is. We know who it is, and he'll be taking place as soon as the United States accepts him as the ambassador, which I'm sure they will do. I will tell you, at the conference, of course, what we have tried to do is the Russian Cultural Center has always maintained an existence and an activities. A lot of it, of course, was oriented towards the Russian-speaking population in the Washington area and in the United States. But it was our idea, was my idea and others last year, that we should also begin to introduce American scholars to speak at the Cultural Center in order to reestablish the relationships between the United States and Russia at a certain level, on the level of science and the level of culture, areas which really should never be broken in spite of political entanglements otherwise. And we had one seminar last year on Vladimir Vernadsky, again with Russian and U.S. and Western scholars. And this time it was in memory of the founding of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which some important professors talking about the first Russian scientist, Mikhail Lomonosov. There was also space historian Brian Harvey, who has written dozens of books on space history, from Ireland, talking about the history of the space program, space cooperation from the Cold War until the present day. And others, Sergei Pulinets, who deals with the science of the ionosphere, who was talking about his work really in collaboration through many, many years with his American compatriots. It was kind of a nostalgic look back on how the situation had been, which has now been severed as a result of the problems in the U.S.-Russian relationship. And the attempt at the Cultural Center is to try and revive this notion as we try and get back in a working relationship between our two countries. I wanted to just say a couple things about my own experience here, kind of a reflections of what I would call a recalcitrant Russophile. from many years before and explain to you why I think it is important that Americans understand what is going on in Russia, what they think, what they want, and how they live and how they operate. For me, it was coming out of the Vietnam War era, both as a soldier and as a civilian. I was not in Vietnam, but I think I was at the Fulda Gap a few times, and maneuvers defending against possible Soviet attack. It was clear at that time that the Vietnam War, at least in my view, that the Vietnam War was a tremendous tragedy. We had no reason for fighting it, and although I volunteered to join the army because I was getting upset with not really having a goal in college and didn't think I should be there just studying to keep, out of the service. I did join, and I realized that the war itself was wrong, absolutely wrong. And maybe I should have, gone to jail or protested or something like that. But I took kind of the easy way out in one sense because of that. But it was, for me, it was a given question that there was no justification for going into a country like Vietnam and simply slaughtering the peasants who were there fighting for their own independence. The other question, however, was more difficult. What was the situation with this Soviet behemoth, which was actually the opposition, the country that we were fighting in this in this war in Vietnam? And I had to figure that out somehow. In order to do that, I figured I had to learn Russian. So I was living in Europe at the time with somebody who was very proficient in Russian, and seeing the Cyrillic language, which was always a mystery to me. I figured that's the way. That's the first thing you got to crack in order to get into the language. Never became fluent in the language, but I did understand in terms of reading it. And I read a lot of Russian literature. And if you go to it and you look and you read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Nikolai Gogol, who was a Ukrainian as well, who wrote in Russian, you see the tremendous depth and beauty, not only of the language, but also of the ideas that they are professing. You get an idea of how the Russians think. And in this research, of course, it was quite clear that while we during the Cold War were always very frightened about the danger of nuclear war and the fact that the Soviets would attack us, there's also the stories. I don't remember myself doing this, but I guess I did, because that was the era of the early 50s where people hid under their desks, in case there were a nuclear war, so you could save yourself from this nuclear bombardment, allegedly. It was the same way in the Soviet Union. They feared us in the same way that we feared them. And they had every right to do that, because in 1945, when we had the atomic bomb and they didn't, there were a lot of threats coming out of the West that we would use that weapon in order to destroy the Soviet Union then, because people were afraid that we would otherwise have to fight in another bloody war, and that would be one way of resolving it. People like Bertrand Russell, so-called peacemaker, was one of the proponents of this nuclear war against the Soviet Union. But there were also within our own military establishment people who were thinking that in that direction. So they were very frightened about this as well. And you see this sometimes reflected in their literature. But if you look at that and you look at the ideas that are being put forward there, Tolstoy's War and Peace, very interesting. I think I've read it 4 times, never in Russian. That would be a bucket list in itself, which I don't know if I'm going to endeavor. But it was very interesting. Last time I read it, I did so because I had read some of the diaries of the famous scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, who was writing during World War II. And he said, everybody now is reading Tolstoy's War and Peace, because they saw that what was happening then was precisely the same thing that Tolstoy experienced when Napoleon was invading Russia. I suspect today that people are also going back to that with the threat of war to try and get the lessons learned from what Tolstoy had said in that. The other people, of course, not only the literature, but also the poetry. And the poetry of Alexander Pushkin, who more than any other poet, probably short of Friedrich Schiller, is really the poet of freedom. He was influenced by the ideas coming out of the French Revolution, the better part of the French Revolution before the shift to the guillotine. That he wanted that implemented in Russia. He was a supporter of what was then the Decembrist revolt, that is, soldiers who had fought in France, who had also caught the bug of the Republican ideal, came back to Russia and decided that this whole issue of serfdom had to be transformed. We had to be eliminated, and finally rose up in revolt against it. And it was crushed brutally. And most of these young officers in the Russian army were sent out to the Gulag, out to Siberia, to colonize and to live there in exile. Pushkin was their poet. Pushkin was the one who gave them a voice. Pushkin himself would have gone onto the barricades. In fact, when there was a whiff of a coming revolt by the Decembrists, Pushkin was offering his services, and they refused because they said to him, "You are so important as the voice of freedom in this country that we cannot allow that voice to be sacrificed." And so he lived on, conducting his poetry, which created the Russian language. He was very fluent in French, and to some extent, his knowledge helped to enrich what was a more primitive language before he got a hold of it, similar to what William Shakespeare did with the English language. He enriched the Russian language. And you can see a lot of the phrases and other things that really stem from Pushkin, in the same way that we use many phrases that come out of William Shakespeare. Same thing with regard to the science. If you look at the achievements of people like Dmitry Mendeleev, the person who formulated the table of the elements, the periodic table, without which chemistry would not be able to function today. This Siberian genius, who never became or never was allowed to become a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences because he had divorced his wife and remarried, which was absolutely taboo in those days, was the one who set in motion the developments of modern science through his own discoveries. The same goes for Vladimir Vernadsky, who developed and elaborated the concept of the biosphere, not simply as something that, growing plants here on Earth, but as a broader view of the entire system of the Earth, including the ionosphere and the stratosphere, that he saw as an intimate part of the biosphere. And it was through his knowledge that we have, in fact, new sciences, including the study of cosmic rays, the study of the ionosphere that was talked about yesterday or 2 days ago at the panel. These things have been vital contributions to the world of science, and they are a part of our culture as well as they are a part of Russian culture, and they should be revered, and they should be understood, and they should be held up as necessary items in the progress of mankind toward a greater future. That's what's being threatened today with this conflict in Ukraine, with this attempt to take down Russian culture. Pushkin, the poet of freedom, who led the fight for the Ukrainians who were involved in this Decembrist movement in the south of Russia, including Ukraine, which was the south of Russia. They are now being destroyed by these Ukrainian fascists who want to institute this Ukrainian language, which had always been studied, which was revered by Vernadsky at the same level as Russian, but would never allow it to become a tool for repressing the greatness that had been the culture of Russia, which had been the source of his education and his development. And those are very important items. The other issue is you look at the more modern eras, the achievements that were made in space. You look at the Sputnik, you look at the flight of Gagarin. These were two issues that initiated for mankind the space age. They were the results of Sergei Korolev, who himself had been sent off to the Gulag in the 1930s on trumped up charges. And what he did there was he digged for gold. And during the time he was in the Gulag, he lost all his teeth. He was rehabilitated first as a prisoner, came back and worked in rocketry during World War II, and then later was exonerated, totally exonerated by 1944, and became the head of the Russian space program. And it was thanks to Korolev and his commitment, in spite of the tragedy, in spite of the atrocities that had been conducted against him and against his family. He was committed to the development of the space program and to the space program in the Soviet Union, which had given him his education as well as it had been his torment. Similarly, with the person who's known as the father of the nuclear bomb, of the hydrogen bomb in Russia, Igor Kurchatov, who himself was a great humanist. He developed the hydrogen bomb because he had to, because they knew that the United States was developing that. And they knew that if the United States only had it, because of the attitude that had been expressed by certain people in the U.S. about Russia and about the Soviet Union, that if they didn't have it, they would be at risk. So he developed that, and he was present at least 3 of the hydrogen bomb tests. And at the third test in the 1950s, he went back to his people in the scientific lab and said, "We can never use this weapon. It was so destructive and so awful that it could never be used in battle." In New Year's Eve, 1950, he made the decision that next year, he got his people on the phone. He says, "Next year, we're not going to work on weapons. We're going to work on magnetic thermonuclear reactors." And by 1954, under all secrecy, which existed in this field at the time for all the countries, they developed the first tokamak reactor, which now has become the workhorse of fusion energy in 54. In 1956, Kurchatov spoke at the same conference, the 20th Party Congress, which was famous for Khrushchev's condemnation of Stalin's crimes. But Kurchatov spoke and said, we have to begin to develop thermonuclear fusion energy, and we cannot do it on our own. It must be an international project, and we have to work with the Americans on this. And he went with Premier Khrushchev for the first visit, probably to England. President Eisenhower had introduced the Atoms for Peace program, and what Kurchatov's speech was, in one sense, was a response on the Soviet side to that Atoms for Peace program. And he went to England to the Harwell nuclear facility, where he gave a speech, and he simply told them how the tokamak worked. He declassified unilaterally all the work which everywhere was being classified. Nobody knew what the tokamak was. Everybody had their own programs to deal with fusion. It was known that this would be a capability, and we're doing it differently. But the Russians, by doing that, he made very clear that this had to be declassified, and it was declassified as time went on. 1956, leading to a tremendous amount of back and forth and discussions between U.S. and Soviet scientists, as well as scientists from all the European countries. And this had been really the kernel of the development of fusion energy, which we now see in an international project in France, which has been set up, was a result of the work of Kurchatov. Kurchatov was also a very educated person, both in Russian literature and in Western literature. And the day he died, he was scheduled to go to hear Mozart's Requiem. And he was talking to the wife of Yuri Khariton, another person who was instrumental in the development of nuclear weapons. And he said to her, I first heard Mozart's Requiem in Leningrad, probably shortly before the war. His family was caught or his mother at any rate, was caught in Leningrad during the siege. And so he was there at the time, probably shortly before the war. And he heard Mozart's Requiem, and he was just overwhelmed by it. And so he was very happy to have that opportunity, at that point when he was talking to Khariton's wife, that he would be going to Mozart's Requiem. And that's when he had a heart attack in the afternoon before he ever got there, and he passed away. A very dramatic story. These are the things that happen in Russia. These are the things that people just don't know because they don't understand the people, the literature, the language, or the thinking. And this is extremely important. That has to be changed if we are ever going to have a working relationship, a fertile, fruitful relationship in science, in culture, and in politics, and in social exchanges between the United States and Russia. And I think that's what everybody should be working for. Let me just mention very shortly the history of U.S. Russia relationships dates back to the American Revolution. Russia is a much older country than the United States. They have a longer written history. We can date them back much longer than we can here in the United States, although people were here at the same time, but we don't have the records or anything to say exactly what had happened. Archaeologists can do that, but we don't have it in the same way. It was different in Russia. Nevertheless, their development as a modern nation was almost simultaneously with our development. Think back that the St. Petersburg, which was the first city designed by Peter to be the source of modern Russia and the gateway to the West. It was on the top. You see the picture of Peter here as a younger man than when he was doing that. He looks very prominent and important. Peter went to the Netherlands and worked as a tradesman in the shipyards because he wanted to understand how ships were being built, because he wanted to build ships. This is what he was. So this is the picture depicts him, but it's probably a romantic picture of a person who was a real, a red-blooded human being who wanted the best for his people. And this was 1703. It was founded. St. Petersburg was founded as a city, but we had not built New Orleans yet. It would not be until 1718. We also were a very, very young country moving on the road to becoming what I call a modern nation, to imbibing the culture of the great Renaissance and everything that had been created in Europe before us. The Russians were in the same position. And ever since the beginning, there was this relationship. In the Revolutionary War, Catherine the Great signed the Treaty of Armed Neutrality to send a message to the British that they should not interfere with the American trade that was ongoing. Secondly, during the Civil War, Alexander II sent a fleet or a ship to New York and a ship to San Francisco from the Russian Navy as a signal to the British that were the British to enter the war, they would have to fight the Russian Navy. And that was a very important signal. That one of those ships came to the port down here near Washington in Alexandria, Virginia, and Mrs. Lincoln went to visit them. So this was a very close relationship, and this proceeded all the way up until World War I. And it was only with the Bolshevik Revolution that relations were broken, but only until 1933. Franklin Roosevelt reinstated that relationship, and since that time, it has not been broken, and even to this day, the diplomatic relationship is still in shape. In terms of the development of science, and I want to concentrate on the notion of the fusion energy, which people talk about AI. AI is going to be, the technology of the future. I don't think that's the case. It will be important. It will have an effect, but it's not a game changer in the same way that the development of thermonuclear fusion energy will change the fate of the nation and provide mankind with a potentially unlimited source of energy. This has been done largely because of the collaboration that has been going on between the US and Russia. Yesterday, one of the most important figures in the Russian fusion program, Yevgeny Velikov, passed away. In the 1970s, the Fusion Energy Foundation, which I was associated with at the time, had brought together Velikov and Edward Teller. And Edward Teller, who had been a pretty fierce, anti-Soviet figure, had a Damascus conversion and understood that at that point that if we were going to develop this energy resource, it had to be on a collaborative basis. And we, the Fusion Energy Foundation, had essentially brought these two people together to create that kind of cooperation, and they did. There were also attempts to bring them together with regard to President Reagan's other attempt at creating a technological breakthrough with the SDI, and they did work together to try and find an agreement, but ultimately the Soviet Union was not prepared to accept a very generous offer from President Reagan of cooperating on a defense against nuclear weapons, which was unfortunate. What did happen, however, is that in 1985, Velikov spoke with Prime Minister Gorbachev to convince him to support an international program to develop thermonuclear fusion energy. He then came to the United States, probably with the help of Dr. Teller or with the assistance of Dr. Teller, who was very close to President Reagan, and convinced President Reagan that he also should participate in this international program, which he did. So that the actual agreements, while the project didn't come about physically until much later, the agreements were actually signed in 1985 because of this collaboration between the United States and then at the Soviet Union, which will serve as the basis for the final development of this very important energy resource. So it's for that reason, I think, that we have to rethink how we view this, what is called the autocratic government in Russia. We didn't have the same system, and during the time of the Soviets, we didn't have the same system during the time of the czars, but we had a very close and good relationship because we had common goals of trying to develop our nations. And each nation, as has been said, continually by Mrs. LaRouche and others, each nation must have the right to development. That should be the fundamental human right. And we cannot do that in a divided world. We cannot do that in a world of rivalry and a bloodthirsty competition. There has to be the cooperation and the mutual understanding. That's what's good for one part has to also be good for the other part. And without that, the world is going into a rather chaotic period. And I think now we have the potential, at any rate, where the United States can concentrate on what it really has to do, and that is rebuilding the infrastructure of the United States, and not be concerned about going, as John Quincy Adams says, seeking abroad for monsters to slay.
Great. Thanks. Shall I bring Chris on? I think will have more, and you and he can have a fruitful dialogue. Or do you have more, Bill?
No, that's it.
Yeah, good. All right. So, Chris. Hi. Come on in. What would you like to add to this discussion? And let me know if I should go to any slides. I'm going to disappear.
Yeah, I mean, you can bring up the slides. Do I have any control over the slides?
I have control over the slides.
Okay, so I'll have to say next. Anyway, well, first of all, I just wanted to say I tried to put the link to the U.S. Russia Cultural Symposium that Bill was the chair of that discussion. I tried to put the link in, but it said that it didn't post.
There's a passcode. I have problems with that. We're doing a link tomorrow in the briefing. I'm sorry.
It was the YouTube link that you sent out.
Right. It was, you had to have passcode, and I didn't have, and the one he sent me didn't work either. So it'll be tomorrow in the briefing that we will have our own YouTube.
I see. Great. So then we can add it later to the comments here.
Yeah, we can get that out. I mean, it was a remarkable discussion, and it was interesting to hear. I mean, first of all, if you look at this question of Ben Franklin, and the fact that at the same time that Lomonosov had set up this chemistry, chemistry lab that was the cutting edge. I mean, long before Mendeleev. This was in the 1743, I think, 1742, 43. That was fascinating because Ben Franklin was setting up the American Philosophical Society at the same exact time. So to what you said about the development of our nation, of course, we weren't even a nation yet, but the development, I mean, Franklin was the founder of this nation, scientifically, culturally. So he's working on science, on electricity, and there's this fruitful dialogue going back and forth through various channels. And there was, as Cliff Kirikoff goes through, and I just really invite people to watch this symposium. We'll get you the link. That there's this dialogue going back and forth about electricity, about chemistry, and that the Russians were intrigued by the fact that this backwater, the United States, the colonies, the British colonies, were making these breakthroughs with Benjamin Franklin in science. And so, if you can bring up some of the slides, I just bring up the one with Leibniz there. Next. Okay, here we go. So this is really exciting because Leibniz, who met with Peter the Great, I believe 3 times in Europe, proposed to Peter the creation of what would become the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he goes through here what you want to do. You want to expand. Go back. To expand and improve the arts and sciences, improve schools, set up museums, improve manufacturers, which is exactly along the lines of what Ben Franklin, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton were fighting to do in the United States. And so I think it's not a mistake that the development of modern Russia under Peter the Great and the United States occurred at the same time, because there was a philosophical conception, the LaRouche of the day, Gottfried Leibniz, who was not. He was wedded to mankind. I mean, his whole idea. Actually, go forward. Go a little bit forward. Next. Yeah, this is just a slide that where he's working on the question of China, Russia, and the American Republic project in Europe, and the idea of creating this republic in the United States, even though it was just a gleam in his eye, but his idea of getting a development span, as LaRouche used to, as LaRouche talked about the Eurasian land bridge, Leibniz was talking about the potential for development from Europe through Russia into China. And so go to the next slide. Next. Okay, why Russia? China and Europe, as the two most extreme ends of this world, would be brought together through the mediation of the Tsar. By this means, Chinese products and news from China would come to Europe, and on the other hand, the Christian faith would spread to China, indeed through Moscow as mediator. The prerequisite for this would be that we bring to Moscow all the institutions which we have in Europe. So this was his proposal to Peter the Great about his idea of spreading civilization, and Peter responded. And as Bill said, Peter was going into Europe, meeting with people like Leibniz, learning how to build ships, learning science, learning how to develop a modern nation state of Russia. St. Petersburg, the beautiful city, was Peter the Great's project, right? This was a modern city, a beautiful city that Peter the Great designed. And go on to the next one. Next. Yeah, so this is just an image. I don't think it got put up before, of the Russian Academy of Sciences, 1725. This is the fruit of Leibniz's work and Peter the Great's work. And Peter the Great dies this year. Leibniz had died, a couple of decades earlier. Peter the Great dies this year, but look what he produces: the Russian Academy of Sciences. And just 15 years later or so, 18 years later, you have Lomonosov, who comes out of this Russian Academy of Sciences and writes volumes on chemistry, on, one thing after the next, but also poetry. And I think, Bill, in that symposium, it really, really struck me that long before Pushkin, Lomonosov was developing the modern Russian language. So he's a scientist, he's a poet, he's, that's who Lomonosov is. We don't even know who this guy is because of the work that you're doing with these professors and others. We can, this 10 volumes of Lomonosov's works. Let's get these out. Let's get this man's work out, because this is the basis, along, with Peter's work, of modern Russia. So go on, next. Next. So yeah, these slides aren't coming out very well, but anyway, there's Ben Franklin. He's working on conquering electricity, bringing electricity to man. And there's a picture on the bottom there of James Logan, who was an associate of Franklin's, who was one of the key people that brought Leibniz's works into the American colonies. Okay, go ahead. Next. So this was also brought up by Kirikov in the symposium, that Ezra Stiles, who was the head of Yale University and who was in a dialogue with Benjamin Franklin. Franklin sends a letter to Stiles to ask Lomonosov, or maybe Stiles sends a letter to Frank. I forget, but there's a whole dialogue going back and forth. You have the development of the exploration of the Arctic Circle, which Franklin is totally intrigued by. And what I heard on the symposium later is that Lomonosov was saying that he believed that there could be a direct link to the Americas over the North Pole, which of course there is, but they were doing all kinds of expeditions looking into that. Apparently Stiles was very, very interested. I think it was Stiles who was interested in the temperatures of Russia. But I mean, Lomonosov dies in 1765. So unfortunately, you know, there doesn't seem to be a direct dialogue between Franklin and Lomonosov. I could be wrong. I don't know, but there was definitely interest in the Russian circles on the question of the electrical experiments that Franklin was doing. And they were very intrigued by that. So next slide. Yeah, that's Shikagov, who's discussed by in the symposium also, the Northeast Passage to America. You can see this is what they're working on with ships all up in the North Pole area. Go ahead. Next. Okay, so Golitsyn, who is this is where it gets interesting in the sense that you have this scientific collaboration going on. Dmitry Golitsyn is Catherine the Great's ambassador to the Netherlands. Now think about this, Catherine the Great, and we did a whole symposium on this. You can go back and find it. It's on the LaRouche Organization's website. There's a symposium that goes more in depth in this, but I just want to touch on it that Catherine the Great is the Tsarina of Russia. Now, you could imagine that she is not exactly thrilled with revolutionary politics, right? The United States, the American Revolution is of interest. She sends a letter. I don't have this letter, but it's amazing. It's really funny because George III writes to her and says, "We need your help putting down the American colonies." And Catherine the Great writes back, "Well, look, cousin, it's great to hear from you, you know, but after the wars against the Turks and everything, our army is tired. We're very tired, and you're going to have to handle this on your own. Good luck." Now, in the meantime, people around her, like Golitsyn, he's in dialogue with Franklin. He's writing letters to Ben Franklin, who's in France at the time, pulling together the means of victory in the American Revolution. He's in dialogue with Golitsyn on matters of electrical experiments. These are the letters that survive. I don't know what else they're in dialogue about. But what I know is that Golitsyn and his friend Aquinas, who is also totally honed in on magnetism, on electricity, and on what Franklin's doing, these two gentlemen are the ones that write the Treaty of Armed Neutrality on behalf of Catherine the Great's government. And this is what this is a big, this is a huge aid to the American the American Republic in the Revolution. Next slide. So there she is, Catherine II of Russia. Next slide. Yep. Next slide. Golitsyn writes to Franklin in January 1777. Next slide. This is Musin Pushkin is the envoy to Great Britain for the Russians. Panin runs the College of Foreign Affairs. Now, one thing, and Bill, you'll be interested in this. I got this book. It's a 1,200-page book that was put out in 1980, and it's writings back and forth between Russians and Americans, and it was put out in 1980 as part of an idea of détente, of uncovering this history, which you're referencing, of U.S.-Russian affairs, that we've been friends longer than we've been enemies by far. And the whole history of this needs to be brought out. So these guys, they're writing these hilarious letters back to all of these ambassadors are writing letters back to the College of Foreign Affairs, and they're all in this book about the progress of the American Revolution. And honestly, they don't seem that unhappy about it. Whatever Catherine the Great might be thinking about it, they're pretty intrigued by the process. And I don't think they particularly like the British Empire either. So, all right, go ahead. Next. Yep. There's the, Osterman. He's the ambassador to France from Russia. He's there when Franklin is in France, and they have letters back and forth too. So you see, under the basis of this a commitment to scientific progress, you also have a commitment to Republican ideas, even though you have the problem that it's the Russian, empire, or whatever you want to call it, but it's not the same system of government that we're going to create, but there's a basis for cooperation. Okay, next. Yep. So that's what I had referenced earlier. Next. So Catherine finds these principles registered in the natural law of peoples, which every nation is justified to demand for itself, and which the belligerent powers cannot ignore without violating the laws of neutrality and without disavowing the rules which they themselves have adopted in diverse treaties and public commitments. Next. That neutral vessels may navigate freely from one point to another and along the coasts of nations at war, that the effects belonging to the subjects of belligerent powers may pass inviolably on neutral ships, with the exception of contraband merchandise, that the Empress, as to the specifications of the above-mentioned merchandise, adheres to what is stipulated in Articles 10 and 11 of her Treaty of Commerce with Great Britain, extending these obligations to all powers at war. Basically saying trade can go on between nations, and this is a direct attack on the control of the waters by the British Empire at the time. Next slide. Next. So just to give you a sense of this, this is so beautiful. Ekaterina Romanova Vortsova-Dashkova, she is the first female president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And she's in a dialogue with Ben Franklin after the successful, completion of our revolution and the creation of our republic. And Ben Franklin is admitted as a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1789 by Dashkova, and he invites her to be a member of the American Philosophical Society. So I think I'll end with that, but just to say, everybody should watch what Diane had spoken of earlier in the beginning, this amazing interview that Tucker Carlson just did with Lavrov. And the very first thing that Lavrov says is that, which is surprising, he says, I wouldn't say we're at war with the United States. In fact, we would like to have good relations with the United States. He calls the United States a great nation. And he talks about I think he talks about our history of collaboration. And this is something that we've got to make a project that we work on, because we've got to have good relations with Russia and China. And there's every reason in the world to do that. There's every reason in the world why it's possible. We are kindred spirits. We come from the same philosophical Leibnizian outlook with whatever imperfections we have. We have to return to that Leibnizian idea. So that's what I would just like to add into the discussion.
Great. This is very exciting. Discussion is making me quite happy and excited. I hope we can stop nuclear war. Bill, any thoughts?
Right. Well, to take Lavrov's statement, Lukashenko, he was the first one to greet Trump, and he said, I hope you make America great, but don't destroy the world in the process. So they're not unhappy with making America great if we did it here, right?
Right.
We've got a lot to do.
We sure do. And frankly, trying to destroy everyone else hasn't really helped us all that much.
No.
How's that working out for us?
No. So I think I'm going to leave it at this and just urge everybody to join the Schiller Institute conference tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at schillerinstitute.com. It's going to be incredible, and we have to get a shift in the U.S. One last thing I just want to report. What Scott said today on the program I was with him on is that he was far more optimistic than he had been before, that he got a very, very good response from the members of Congress. And I think he's circulating, it sounded like some kind of letter that they were signing on to, that he is focusing on getting President-elect Donald Trump to come out and say, when I take office, there will be no more ATACMS missiles. There will be no more long-range missile launches into Russia. That has to be known now, that's the policy. The new Congress comes in January 3rd. And then in 3 weeks, Trump, or less than that, I guess, 2.5 weeks later, Trump will be inaugurated. So it's a small window. We really have to get a shift. I think I am not quite as optimistic as Scott about the Congress, having just run for office myself and seen the incredible duplicity and corruption of these people. But it is true that they can be moved. And everybody should be calling their congressman, and you should send them emails, and you should also post the links to the Schiller Institute conference. Help us build this far and wide. Lastly, I just want to announce here, if you're in New York, I have filed a lawsuit with the Rockland County Supreme Court against the Rockland County Board of Elections, that my vote was so bizarrely low, and this is often the way our enemies do things, is they're so arrogant that they get themselves in trouble, that I was able, in a very short amount of time, with just a few inquiries, to discover more people who voted for me than they counted. For example, in my precinct, they said I had 5 votes. I just walked down my street and discovered 7 votes, and that's not even the whole precinct by far. And most of the people who voted for me were willing to sign affidavits and join a court case to demand a hand count of the paper ballots. I'm not saying I think I won the election. I don't want to overturn the election. I am saying that one of the reasons that these corrupt sadists in the Congress feel like they can get away without listening to us is that they get these fake polls and these fake results, and they say, oh, only 0.5% of the population voted for Diane Sare. So obviously everyone thinks we should send unlimited weapons to Ukraine and Israel and blow up the world. That's what my constituents like. Well, in reality, I may have gotten between 6 and 10% of the vote. That's a big deal. Similarly, Jill Stein, who was kept off the ballot in the state of New York, and they said her vote was, well, not even in New York. They haven't even counted her vote yet, which is against state election law. don't get me started. I could go on and on about the corruption here, but they mostly said that her vote was 0.4%. I don't believe it. We saw the uncommitted vote in the Democratic primaries. So if you are in or near Rockland County, I will have 20 days to find a whole bunch more people who voted for me. And I need people who are willing to go door to door or make calls in certain precincts and help us get this done. And you can actually volunteer for that by signing up at the LaRouche Organization. You can sign up at the LaRouche Organization to volunteer. Put a note that says you want to help with the canvassing in Rockland County. Election integrity is something that we are definitely interested in. And we can find those people, and it's going to be fun. And that is secondary to surviving, however. So let's be at the Schiller Conference tomorrow. And thank you both very much for joining me. And I look forward to hopefully being here next week.
We do too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Diane.
Thanks.
Thank you, Don.
We'll see
Thank you,
you
Bill.
there.